Section 28 of Richelieu by Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 9, Fine Arts, General Summary, Part 3. From architecture to sculpture, the transition is an easy one. A mere walk through the parks of Versailles, Fontainebleau, and Saint-Germain shows at once how rich the French 17th century was in treasures of that description, to say nothing of the masterpieces preserved in the churches, private residences, and museums. Henry IV, so fond of the fine arts and so liberal in his encouragement of them, had attracted to France a number of distinguished men in every speciality. The unsettled state of the country, however, during the minority of Louis XIII, had the effect of scattering in foreign parts all artists who enjoyed a certain amount of reputation, and at the same time, when Cardinal Richelieu came to power, the only sculptors residing in France were Toussaint Chenu and Guillain, renamed Le Cambrai, from the place of his birth. The former of these artists is chiefly known by the bronze figures which he made for the fountains on the Place de Grève, Paris. Guillain Cambrai, 1581 to 1658, was the author of a monumental tomb designed for the chapel of the Minims. It excited universal admiration at the time when it was first produced, and most of the old historians of Paris allude to it in very flattering terms. Wood carving, required as it was for the decoration of churches, was also much in demand, and the Cambrai artist found continual occupation in that specialty. However able Guillain Cambrai may have been in his art, his reputation rests principally on the pupils he trained, and amongst them a special notice must be reserved for his son Simon Guillain, and Jacques Sarrazin, a native of Noyon. These two artists, after having executed some works of an ecclesiastical character, went off together to Italy, with the view of studying the masterpieces of antiquity and of the Renaissance period. At that time, Michelangelo was the maestro whose style was most popular, and whose compositions all students aimed at imitating. The first productions of the two friends executed at Rome were close copies of the great Florentine artist. Sarrazin was fortunate enough to make the acquaintance of Domenichino, to learn painting under his direction, and thus insensibly accustomed himself to a simple and more graceful style of art. Guillain was the first to return to Paris. He soon rose into celebrity, and assembled in his studio a large number of pupils, including the two brothers, François and Michel Anguillet, who did so much to raise to perfection the French school of sculpture. Guillain's bronze statues of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria are still to be seen at the Museum of the Louvre. He became one of the first founders of the Academy of Painting and Sculpture. Jacques Sarrazin remained in Italy for the space of 18 years. His success there was of the most brilliant description, and it was not without much hesitation that he made up his mind to return to his native country. He found on his arrival that the tide of popularity had turned in favour of a Flemish artist, François Duquesnoy, 1594 to 1646, whose carvings in bronze, marble, ivory, and wood, after having created the most unheard of enthusiasm in Italy, were now much appreciated by the Paris virtuosi. Richelieu, as a matter of fact, was so thoroughly struck by their perfections that he proposed to Duquesnoy to settle in Paris and create there a school of sculpture. Whether the offer was refused or simply forgotten does not appear. At any rate, Duquesnoy died shortly after in Italy, poisoned, it is said, by his own brother. Simon Guillain made a great deal of money by his works. He was extremely active, and besides he employed a number of pupils who carried on his compositions in bronze, marble, wood, and stone. The principal statues, which he did himself, were those of the portal of Saint Gervais, the figures which decorate the high altar of the Minims in the Place Royale, including a magnificent statue of the Virgin, the statues belonging to the portal of the Church of the Sorbonne, and later on the monument raised to the memory of Louis XIII near the approach to the Pont au Change, Paris. The brothers Anguillet remain to be mentioned. They were the sons of a carpenter, and manifested at an early age such a disposition for artistic pursuits that they were sent to Paris with a view of studying under Guillain. Francois then went to England, where he raised money enough by his talent to enable him to go to Italy. There he made the acquaintance of several eminent painters, such as Poussin, Mignard, Dufresnoy, etc., and after a residence of 2 years in Rome, he returned to Paris and obtained from Louis XIII apartments at the Louvre, together with the post of curator of the Musée des Antiques. The chief works of Francois Anguillet were designed for the Paris churches. They comprise a statue of Cardinal de Bérulle, formerly in the Oratoire Rue Saint-Honoré, a monumental pyramid with trophies, statues, etc., in honour of the Longueville family, and the statue of the Duc de Rohan-Chabot, etc. Some of these compositions are now in the museum of the Petit Augustin. The principal work of Anguillet is the mausoleum he raised to the memory of the ill-fated Duc de Montmorency, whose condemnation and death we have previously described. It had been ordered for the convent of the nuns of St. Mary at Moulins, and although it belongs to a later period, 1658, yet as it was his masterpiece, we thought we could not leave it unmentioned. Michel Anguillet obtained even more reputation than his brother. He too made the classical journey to Italy, but without any resources than those which his talent gave him, and on his arrival at Rome he was fortunate enough to attract the notice of a distinguished artist, who introduced him to some rich families, for whom he did important works, besides contributing to the embellishment of the Church of St. Peter. The productions with which he enriched his native country are posterior to the death of Richelieu, and it is only in 1686 that Michel Anguillet died in Paris at the ripe age of 74, after a glorious career as an artist, loved and respected by all who knew him. Metal engraving was particularly encouraged by Louis XIII and Richelieu. Guillaume Dupré first, and then Jean Véron, his pupil, carried it to a state of perfection which has never been surpassed. And in connection with this part of our subject, we may remark that the whole monetary system of France, then in a state of almost hopeless disorder, was revised and settled upon a proper basis. The catalogue of engravers, properly so called, includes many distinguished artists, such as the two Audran, Karl and Claude, Abraham Bosse, and Michel Lannes. Abraham Bosse has written on the art of engraving a work which was very popular at the time when it appeared. He treated all sorts of subjects, historical, popular, serious, grotesque, and might be compared to Callot, of whom we shall speak presently, if there were more variety in his compositions, more life, more entrain. We have often admired in museums and private collections the beautiful portraits of historical characters which belong to the early 17th century. Balthazar Montcornet, Tavernier, Henri Chéron, Gabriel Vuillemot are the artists to which we owe these masterpieces. Nor must we imagine that Paris had the monopoly of good engravers. Tours could boast of its Claude Vignon, and Mantes of its Pierre Brabiet, Toulouse of its Hilaire Pradet, Châteauroux of its Nicolas Chapron, Nancy of its Jacques Callot. We have kept for the last Jacques Callot, who combined the qualities of painter, draughtsman, and engraver, and who is perhaps, in the fine arts, the best representative of the reign of Louis XIII. Without being what we should call now a bohemian, Jacques Callot led the life of a merry, easy-going companion, enjoying his days of sunshine, and managing to get without much anxiety through his hours of depression and penury. The early life of Callot was one of the most romantic description. He met with adventures sufficient enough in number and exciting enough in character to supply the materials of a novel. Finally he settled down at Nancy, his native place, and refusing the brilliant offers made to him by Pope Urban VIII, of the Emperor Ferdinand, and Louis XIII, he preferred devoting himself entirely to the pursuit of his art in the province where his earliest recollections and affections were centred. The patriotism of Callot was equal to his extraordinary talent. The King of France ordered him to draw and etch the representation of the siege of La Rochelle and the taking of the Isle of Ré. He consented at once, but when he was requested to commemorate in the same manner the siege of Nancy by the French, he refused in the plainest terms. "I had rather," answered he, "cut off my own thumb than do anything contrary to the honour of my prince and my country." So noble an answer could not but commend itself to a monarch who appreciated dignity of character and patriotic feelings. Louis XIII immediately offered Callot a pension of 3,000 livres and a place in the royal household. But the painter was too fond of his liberty to accept even so tempting a proposal, and remained at Nancy, where he died at a comparatively early age. It would take us too long to enumerate Callot's works. We may just say that they are all characterized by an amount of verve we seldom meet with, and the only modern French artist who at all reminds us of him is Charlet. In representing the comic side even of serious subjects, Callot has never been surpassed. He excels in giving us the exaggerated or caricature likeness of the insolent Reiter, the soldier of fortune who followed Wallenstein, Tilly, or Montecuccoli during the vicissitudes of the 30 Years' War, the siege of Magdeburg, and the battle of Lützen. His spirited and delicate etchings are never coarse or vulgar, even when he seems to allow full swing to his wit. In one word, he is par excellence the artist of the early 17th century. His Supplices, his Malheurs et Misères de la Guerre, his Gueux contrefaits are the best illustrations possible of the memoirs of Bassompierre, d'Aubigne Baron de Feneste, and Sorel's Histoire de Francion. Callot's works comprise 1,000 pieces, the most striking in point both of conception and execution being La Fête de la Madone de l'Imprunette, the view of the Pont Neuf in Paris, and especially that extraordinary engraving which represents the Temptation of St. Anthony. Music occupied a very prominent part in the pastimes of the court during the reign of Louis XIII. This monarch was himself an excellent musician. On Shrove Tuesday of the year 1618, he danced in a ballet containing a tune which he had composed, and the harmony of which was written by Beauchamp, one of the 24 violins of the royal household. A 4-part song of his, elegantly written and quite correct from the scientific point of view, has been published by Kircher. Several manuscript compositions still exist, testifying to his skill. He wrote a few hunting tunes, and even set to music some of the Psalms. Godot, in his Paraphrase des Psaumes de David, writes as follows: "The late king of glorious memory had not disdained to employ on 4 of my Psalms the perfect knowledge he had of that fine art. These compositions have been published, and the best masters admire them." The fashion of ballet music, which had already manifested itself in France during the reigns of the last 3 Valois and that of Henry IV, rose to a very high standard under Louis XIII. The instrumental resources available were not, of course, what they are to-day, but the names of several excellent performers on the violin have reached us, more particularly that of Guillaume du Manoir, who delighted Louis XIII. So much that the king created for him the office of Roi des Violons, giving him at the same time a patent by virtue of which he could, for a payment of 10 livres, deliver certificates to students and virtuosi, duly qualified to teach, play at concerts, etc., etc. Music, thus encouraged, made rapid progress, and the list of distinguished professionals during the first half of the 17th century is a long and respectable one. End of section 28.